The Channel Islands were the only part of the British Isles to be invaded by the German armed forces during the Second World War. And this is the story of their occupation, including film from captured German newsreels. Lying near the coast of France, between Normandy and Brittany, the islands have belonged to the kings and queens of England for 900 years, and their way of life is British. But throughout the war, they were under the orders of an army from the continent. The summer of 1939 was warm and dry, and the Channel Islands had their tourists as usual from the United Kingdom. No one thought much about a man called Adolf Hitler or the marching jackboots in Czechoslovakia. Although the war clouds were drifting nearer, the holidaymakers idled through those golden, carefree days, and few realized it was to be their last summer in the islands for some time. The big event in Guernsey that year was the opening of the new airport, which, with the other one in Jersey, marked the beginning of a new mode of travel and put the islands within 2 hours flying time of London. The Royal Air Force gave style to the occasion with an air display. The airport seemed to promise a great future for tourism. But the real future which lay ahead was not one for tourists. For the visitors who landed the following summer were to stay far longer than the customary 2 weeks. In the spring of 1940, when the German army broke through to the English Channel, the tide of war flowed westwards, on land, in the air, and on the seas. Norway and Denmark had already fallen after Poland, then Holland, Belgium, and northern France, leaving the last escape routes from Dunkirk and St. Malo. France was only 15 miles from Jersey, whose bailiff at that time was Alexander Coutances, the civic head of the island, now Lord Coutances.
When the Lieutenant Governor and I heard that the German army had crossed the Seine, we knew that the war was coming perilously close to the Channel Islands. We communicated at once with the War Office and the Home Office.
To the Home Office in London, the Channel Islands had seemed far away from the front line of the war, deserted as they were now that the tourists had gone. But the swift advance of Hitler's armies had cast a sudden black shadow over the peaceful bays and harbors. Could they be defended? Alexander Coutances faced the gravest emergency of his career.
The Home Office telephoned to say that the Chiefs of Staff had advised that it was impossible or unwise to attempt to hold the Channel Islands, which would be demilitarized. All military personnel, militia, and everybody else concerned would be withdrawn, and as he was a soldier, the Lieutenant Governor must also go. We were told that shipping would be provided as far as was humanely possible for anybody who wanted to leave the island.
Thousands were evacuated to England. Many children had to leave without their parents, who were not to see them again for 5 years. One of those in the evacuation queues was a young Jersey woman who recalls that day of decision.
Some people said we were deserting the island, but actually we wanted to do what we could for the war effort in England. It was really tragic to leave our new home because we'd just been married and we didn't know if we'd ever get back to it. We didn't really know if we'd get to England because of the submarines about. Thousands of people were crowding on to the ships. Many of them drove down to the quay in their cars, left their cars on the quay for anyone to have. People had to register at the town hall, and the queue was halfway round the town. I kept thinking, should I go or not? But I thought I would go, as my husband was joining the forces, and I wanted to be with him.
In fact, nearly 2,000 Channel Islanders joined the forces in England. A week after the evacuation, rumour and fear became a reality. The first German planes swept over the islands. On that summer afternoon in Guernsey, an eyewitness, who was then only 15, was watching from the harbour.
I saw the aircraft flying overhead, and then they made an approach towards the quay. I was in St. Peter Port, but I heard they also had flown over St. Helier as well. They weren't very high, and we wondered what was going to happen. They started dropping incendiary bombs, which set fire to a number of tomato lorries standing along the quay. These collapsed on the occupants, who were sheltering underneath. There were 5 or 6 children playing along the quay, and when the planes opened up with machine guns, they got mown down.
The islanders, shocked and bewildered, counted their dead. They suddenly realized that Hitler meant business. This was it. In Jersey, Alexander Coutanche waited.
The telephone rang. I went out, and it was May Sherwell, the wife of Ambrose Sherwell, the Attorney General of Guernsey, speaking. She said, "The Germans have arrived here. Ambrose has gone down to the Royal Hotel to meet them, as requested. His last words to me were, 'Telephone to you and tell you.' I said, 'It may be a long time before we speak again. Thank you. God bless you.' I got a message from Charles Roche, the controller of the airport, whilst I was in my chambers, to say that a single German plane had landed at the airport. I said to Colonel Hulton, the government secretary who was by my side, 'It's time we went and struck the Union Jack.' We went up to the Fort Regent, and we did there and then strike the Union Jack. I had been told, whilst I was in the process of doing it, that the Germans had arrived at the airport, and they requested me to go out at once in order that the surrender could be done officially out there. I went out, and what I thought was the final act of surrender took place. I came home, and after a certain delay, I sat down with my wife to dinner when my man, my chauffeur, houseman, came in, an old soldier, and he said to me, "The drive is full of Jerrys."
The occupation had begun. The Germans lost no time in flying in their first contingent of troops, later to grow to the colossal total of 30,000 men, equivalent to half the remaining British population. Over the waters, the magic island of Sark. The 400 inhabitants were still there, as if unable to leave this enchanted kingdom of fairies and witches, ruled over by a feudal seigneur, as it had been for hundreds of years. The Germans, landing from a ship, must have wondered where they were, coming into the tiny harbour. To speak to the Dame of Sark, then Sybil Hathaway, the Germans were told they would have to go and see her at the Seigneurie. She had no intention of coming to meet them.
Of course, we knew the Germans were coming, and we arranged to meet them in the drawing room. I had my maid show them in as if she always showed in German officers. They were very respectful. I heard them wiping their feet on the doormat when they came in, and I said to my husband, "Oh, that's a sign of respect for the house," so we're all right, I think. They came and gave us massive orders, and when I replied in German, they seemed perfectly satisfied and said they were only going to leave 10 men. and we thought we were going to get off rather lightly. But after a little while, more and more came, and all went fairly quietly until we had our first commando raid. And that upset everything. They got very suspicious. They thought we'd been in contact with them. They killed 2 Germans in the hotel. They got right through the minefield, and they imagined, of course, there was some hidden in the island, and our houses got searched, and altogether we had rather thin time. But that was nothing to what we had when one of the Germans, who was going to the Russian front, murdered the German doctor. Then we were all under suspicion, and some days the men had to report twice a day, and they tightened up everything. No going out anywhere. You had to be in at 5 o'clock every afternoon, and altogether life was made very difficult. And then after that, they put 13,500 mines down on the top of the island, so we couldn't get access to the sea anywhere.
With mines in Sark and tanks trundling around Jersey and Guernsey, everyone could see that a massive military occupation was in full swing. The islands were a great prize for Hitler. He was showing the world that his forces were already on British soil. Indeed, some of the German troops thought they were on the Isle of Wight. And so the occupation of the Channel Islands proceeded as it would have done in the United Kingdom, if Hitler had reached London. Public buildings were taken over by the German command, and it was hard for the islanders to accustom themselves to the sight of a British policeman acting as chauffeur to German officers. The German language was made compulsory in schools. There was a curfew, food rationing, and a ban on the use of motor cars, except for military and civil officials. Newspapers were taken over, and a special paper for German troops was printed under orders by the local press, as remembered by a Jersey editor, Arthur Harrison.
We had to print that on an instruction from the States. Then there was our paper in English. The Germans wanted us to print 5 columns of their propaganda every day. There was nothing we could do about it, except let them make fools of themselves. They gave us some very peculiar English, and I simply let this go through without correction. In that way, you could see it was a German version of the news. It wasn't very easy, though, having to publish in this situation.
The coasts were now frontiers, with only the sea beyond. And the Channel Islanders found themselves face to face with the Germans. They had to live with them. The ordinary German troops were often friendly, and the question was, ought they to be treated as normal human beings? If a German spoke to you in English, would you refuse to answer? And how long could this be kept up? They were everywhere, in the lanes, on the farms, all over the countryside. And as the months went by, the islanders had to come to terms with their new visitors. Off-duty, the soldiers relaxed in their recreation centres. 2 of them were billeted in the house of a Guernseyman.
On the whole, the ordinary Germans seemed quite decent. We got used to seeing them about the place. We began thinking they were just like anyone else. But you soon realized you had an argument going on in your head. One part of you knew they were enemies, but the next moment you'd think, but they're quite decent, really. After all, you couldn't help thinking they must be human. It was a mental conflict. They were there, and we had to deal with them. You can't understand this state of mind unless you've lived through an occupation.
But soon, another side of the German system began to show itself. Things were happening in Alderney, the most remote of all the islands, lying 21 miles to the northeast of Guernsey. The entire population had left before the Germans came, and the Nazis found only a deserted town and 3 square miles of sparse fields. They turned it into a concentration camp, the Alcatraz of the Channel Islands. After the war, captured German soldiers were brought over from Jersey to take down the barbed wire fences and dismantle the fortifications. One of them was Karl Kurt, who stayed on in the island ever since.
I came to Alderney in July 45. When we arrived here, we started off taking all the barbed wire away, to clear the roads and the fields and all that. It was just one big fortress all you could see was barbed wire, bunkers, trenches. Along the lower road that was full of ammunition, already stacked, ready to be dumped.
There were many Karl Kurts during the occupation. This was the human dilemma. An average conscripted German living side by side with average Channel Islanders, all caught up in a war made by others. When Karl Kurt was taken to Alderney, the SS had gone. There was no sign of the uniformed strong-arm men with their rubber truncheons and whips, or the captives doing forced labor. Through the pleasant squares and streets, gangs of political prisoners from all over Europe were taken up the hill to the concentration camp, where the SS guards had the power of life and death over them. In those days, no news came out of Alderney. Who knows what happened to the camp victims? Even today, the few people who do know are unwilling to talk. But stories leaked out of torture and barbaric executions. It is said that some prisoners were marched down the harbor breakwater and pushed over the edge to drown. Years later, heaps of human bones were discovered by divers near the edge of the harbor quay. Another shock for the islanders was the arrival of hundreds of slave workers. In Jersey, they built an underground hospital. It was tunneled out of a rocky hill by gangs of men in rags, laboring under the beatings of their Nazi overseers and making deep caverns in the brittle rock face. The pink granite earth crust, with its glitter of quartz, offered a hard resistance to the picks and shovels of the Russians and other foreign prisoners who formed the labor force of the Todt organization. Men died from exhaustion or from the rock falls which crushed them in the vast caverns ever lengthening under the ground. But the subterranean rooms took shape at last, furnished with every comfort for the German officers and nurses who staffed the hospital. They had their rest room laid out like a club with electric light, heating, and air conditioning. Everything arranged with German efficiency and made to last. Nearby was the office of the commandant. He was in charge of a vast catacomb of rooms and passages covering 4 acres of ground. But the hospital was never used. Before it could be made ready, the war had ended, and the uniforms were no longer needed either, mere relics of a grim charade. In the long wards, the hospital beds lay empty, while the exhausted prisoner workers slept on boards in their dormitory huts. Harold Ladrilnek, a Jersey schoolmaster. He was one of those who made a personal gesture of resistance to the German occupiers, and he paid for it in various concentration camps, ending up in Belsen. One day during the occupation, his sister Louisa Gould gave shelter to an escaped Russian, a prisoner of war from the labor gangs. Harold Ladrilnek and members of his family agreed to help and share the risks. In the end, he was arrested and sent to the deadly concentration camps. His sister Louisa was arrested too and taken to the camp at Ravensbrück, where she died in a gas chamber. He survived Neuengamme and Belsen. Sabotage of German planes at Jersey Airport was another of the individual acts of defiance against the enemy. It was arranged by the airport controller, Charles Roche. He had the grass on the runways cut shorter than the regulation 4 inches, so that German planes skidded and crashed when landing. 28 planes were put out of action in this way and lay crumpled on the runway. In Guernsey, an underground news sheet was published by 5 patriots.
We took the news from secret radios and sent copies all over the island. But in the end, the Gestapo got us. And the tragedy of it all, 2 of us never came back.
Even an occupation postage stamp carried a mark of defiance, showing a GR for George Rex by the threepenny price figure, put in by the designer, Edmond Blampied. In a Jersey printing works, 2 men look back on the occupation years and think themselves lucky to be alive. Stanley Green was sent to Buchenwald after photographing a map showing German gun positions. His son, Morris, devised and printed a Christmas card, which passed from hand to hand under the eyes of the Germans. When it was opened, it showed two sloping lines, but when folded, the two lines made the V for victory sign. Morris Green still remembers the SS men coming for his father. They never found the Christmas card. Francois Cornet, a young Frenchman, escaped in a boat from France with 15 others. They tried to reach England to join the Free French. The Germans caught them on the Guernsey coast, but when they stepped ashore, they were singing the Marseillaise. All were imprisoned except Francois Cornet, who was executed by a firing squad.
Fire!
The islanders now knew that although some ordinary German troops might be quite friendly, their fanatical leaders were not. And in 1942, Hitler's order came for mass deportations to Germany. Hitler's order for the mass deportations to Germany took effect in the Channel Islands in September 1942. All British residents born in the United Kingdom had to go, including women and children. But for some reason, they were not sent to the grim concentration camps, but to the relatively mild internment centers like Biberach. One of the prisoners remembers the years he spent there behind barbed wire.
It wasn't very pleasant being taken from our homes and sent to Germany. If it hadn't been for the Red Cross food parcels, we'd hardly have survived on the German diet of black bread and potatoes. I think we were sent there as hostages, and the Germans made a special effort to show off a miserable situation as a model internment camp. That was for propaganda. Our wives were there with the children, but they were in a different part of the camp. The worst thing was the anxiety. We never knew whether we were to be sent on to a far worse place.
Back in the islands, the days of the occupation went on. The German bands played the same marching tune which got on people's nerves. No one came out in the streets for the German music, but the islanders went in their thousands to attend funerals for the torpedoed British sailors of HMS Charybdis, whose bodies had been washed up on the beaches. The islanders mourned the dead, but the problems of the living went on. There was a constant concern for food supplies, and the food organizer in Guernsey was Raymond Faller.
We were fortunate in that our glasshouses were in full production with fresh vegetables. We also decided that the stocks of corn which we held for seed, which were going to be sold for the following year, would be milled. And we milled some considerable quantity which were used as breakfast food. We also milled 50 tons of the German stocks, unbeknown to them. We established a slaughter policy with our cattle. In fact, we culled all the herds and slaughtered the older animals and quite a lot of the younger ones in order to provide us with meat. For this purpose, we had to keep 2 sets of books, and the Germans were never informed of the correct slaughter weight.
When D-Day came and the Allied invasion forces were landing in nearby Normandy, the islanders chalked up V for victory signs, believing the war was nearly over. But liberation was still a year away, and their hardest time was yet to come. As the Allies advanced along the French coast, the Channel Islands became an isolated enemy outpost in a state of siege, cut off not only from England, but from the mainland of France. In Alderney, the German garrison received orders to man the heavy guns and bombard the port of Cherbourg.
Richtung 336 Grad.
Eine Salve. 14. Salve.
From Cherbourg, HMS Rodney replied. Clearly, the progress of the Allies in France was causing alarm to the German generals. Hitler was convinced that the Channel Islands would soon be attacked, and he ordered them to hold out to the last man. This meant no food if the siege continued, as the Bailiff of Jersey realized.
The food situation got very much worse after D-Day. I think perhaps it can best be described by pointing out that we had no coal, no gas, no electricity, very little wood, and that the supplies of potatoes and wheat were running short.
No more crops would come from the winter fields. The cold winter at the end of 1944. Alexander Coutances asked for a list to be made of the remaining food supplies. He found that the last meager stocks would be exhausted by December, with starvation facing the islanders in the new year. He prepared a report and persuaded the German command to send it to Switzerland for forwarding on to the British government in London.
It is a matter of history that the document did get to London and did get to the cabinet, and that it was decided that the Red Cross would be asked to come to our aid. But it took a very long time before that help actually materialized.
People were now living on seaweed and parsnip tea. Real tea cost £20 a packet on the black market. Bicycles cost £50 and had to be ridden without tires, although a practical man could make some sort of tire out of a rubber hosepipe. What kept the islanders going was the radio news, picked up on homemade crystal sets. One man who made many crystal sets was a French priest in Jersey, Father Charles Ray.
I put a crystal set inside a typewriter ribbon tin. All these sets has to be small so that they could easily be concealed. The Germans had made it illegal to listen to the wireless. This crystal set is inside the watch. This was an excellent way of hiding it, because it was quite natural that you should carry a watch in your pocket. It had to be connected with an aerial and earth, which I did with small clips. We had been told how to make these sets by the BBC. Anyone who had a set passed on the news to his neighbor. Sometimes we used old telephone earpieces, provided perhaps by a post office engineer. The set was tuned to a definite wavelength, and you had to find just the right spot on the crystal. But it was wonderful when you suddenly heard the London news coming through.
In the last days of December 1944, the answer came to the document sent by Alexander Coutances to Switzerland. It was the Swedish ship Vega, carrying food parcels, medical supplies, and soap, sent by the New Zealand, Canadian, and British Red Cross societies.
I was only about 9 years old when the Red Cross parcels started arriving, and at that time food had come to mean a staple diet of black bread and potatoes or swedes cooked at the communal bakehouse. So it was just like fairyland to slit open those heavy cardboard boxes and find tins of food. I didn't remember having seen such things before. To a child who'd forgotten that there'd been a different kind of life before the occupation, it was a fantastic new experience to taste such things.
Nobody yet knew but plans for the relief of the Channel Islands were being made over the water in England. And in command of the task force was Brigadier Alfred Snow.
Now, we had no military information about the Channel Islands. Lots of us knew about the Channel Islands, but nobody knew anything about them from the point of view of a military operation. And so the first thing we had to do was to start reconnaissance of them. And that started in January 1944 by aerial reconnaissance. And in the end, we had a very, very complete air map of what the Germans' defenses were like. We were prepared to go in against a certain amount of resistance, unorganized resistance, such as mutinous German troops or rioting German troops and so on. And we were prepared to go in over the breaches if the Germans had damaged the ports, as they'd done in so many other places on the coast of France.
In the months that followed, the Germans kept a lookout on the Channel, expecting the British to come any day. They were hungry, and many of them would have been glad to surrender. Some even committed suicide, having learned that their families in Germany had been killed in air raids. And then, on the first day of May, the news came. Hitler was dead. It made no difference to the island's commander. He said he would hold out even after the war had ended. The war did end 8 days later, and off Guernsey at Les Anvois, a rendezvous was arranged for the surrender of the German garrisons. The British were on their way.
When I got to the Hanwars at 2 p.m., I was met by a rusty old German minesweeper containing one Lieutenant Commander Zimmermann. And he had come when he was brought aboard. He said he had come to negotiate an armistice. I said, there's nothing to do, there's nothing about an armistice. This is total surrender, and it is total surrender without strings. And now will you please go back and send somebody here by midnight who is empowered to sign this total surrender. He then said to me, well, my commander says that if you hang about here, we shall treat it as a hostile act and fire on you. And you must withdraw. And I said, well, if you do open fire on us, I'm quite certain that your commander and some others of you will be hanged. Just before midnight, off Les Anvois again, out came the minesweeper again, this time bringing General Heine, who was the island commander, who was empowered to sign the surrender terms. And these he did on the quarterdeck of HMS Bulldog at 7:15 the next morning.
The Royal Navy ships had come. It seemed like a miracle. And for the landing craft bringing in the British troops, what a welcome. The islanders went mad with joy. On radios and relayed through loudspeakers, the victory speech of Winston Churchill. He announced the ceasefire along all the fronts of the war. And then he said,
and our dear Channel Islands are also to be freed today.
The ships bringing the forces of relief had come loaded with a cargo as well. Enough food to feed the islands for 14 days. Crates and boxes of supplies that no one had seen in the shops for 5 years. But above all, it was the sight of British troops which stirred the crowd. There were still mines along the beaches, and 3,000 of the German prisoners were retained for clearing operations. It was not only the mines the Germans left behind, but war supplies of all kinds, the cast-off debris of an army in defeat, weapons which would never be used again, and the well-known Bosch helmets, which had spread terror and despair throughout Europe. It was the end of the Third Reich. A month later, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth arrived by ship. Their portraits were back in the town halls and other official buildings. Many people had kept pictures of the King and Queen in their homes all through the occupation. But now the islanders saw them face to face, and they knew that their long tradition of protection by the British monarch was being confirmed and renewed. Today, the Channel Islands keep in step with the new age. Like other countries overrun by the Nazis, they had to change or perish in the competitive world of the post-war years. The islanders are a proud people with a way of life they've kept for centuries. One thing they learned from their time of trial was to cherish the freedom and independence their forefathers so jealously guarded throughout a long history. Now, a new generation goes shopping where once the Germans spent their occupation marks. On headland and bay, the coasts are free again of Nazi uniforms. And only the concrete bunkers remain as mementos of the 5 years of occupation. 5 years the islanders will never forget.